At the start of the movie, we see a SUV pull up to a gate where armed men are looking on nervously. Suddenly, the guard is shot dead. The others open fire on the car, causing it to crash. The men come to check when someone opens fire from the back seat. It is former police officer Chris who takes out the men until he is shot. 3 days before, we meet Chris, who runs a dojo, working out, sparring, and displaying self-defense techniques. We then see him addressing a class of students, teaching them that the best way to deal with an attacker is first to defuse the situation, telling them that giving up their wallet is easier and safer than fighting. One man takes offense to this, noting that he won't hand over his belongings like that, and that he did not come to learn Eastern philosophy. He demands his money back, and Chris agrees to refund him after class. But the man aggressively steps up to Chris, who calmly pulls out his wallet. The man smartly decides to leave instead. Chris then continues teaching the class. After the class, Chris is cleaning up when Lieutenant Archer comes to visit him. Chris already knows that Archer will ask him again to rejoin the police force, but this time she wants him to come back and train the officers, offering him the freedom of creating his own curriculum and his own rules. Chris initially refuses, and Archer accepts, but reminds him of the good his father did and tells him the offer is still open. She leaves, and Chris looks over the photo of his brother, dad, and himself. He returns to his apartment soon after and gets settled in. He remembers the fight he had with his brother after their father died, and he goes to retrieve the photo of them he had hidden away. The next day, Chris turns up at the precinct and recalls the day he walked out, never guessing that he would return. He heads inside, where he catches the eyes of officers, and heads to the gym, where he finds his brother Ken there playing basketball. The two calmly talk about how they have an unfinished game of basketball, and Chris tells Ken about his new role teaching defusing and disarming techniques. At that moment, Sergeant Hatton and another cop enters, and we can see that he is not fond of Chris from the get-go. He learns about Chris's upcoming seminars and mocks him, then tells Chris to show him a technique. Chris politely declines, but Archer, who is passing by, tells him to go ahead. Chris opens his case and reveals a prop gun and hands it to Hatton, then pulls out a marker, telling Hatton that a mark means he is dead. Hatton thinks he has this in the bag and gives the go-ahead, but Chris is on him in a flash and marks him right in the face. Ken smirks at Chris, proud of his brother, and Archer tells Hatton to go do some paperwork, but we can see that he is extremely embarrassed. After, Archer and Chris talk in her office, where he is concerned about Hatton's attitude, but Archer indicates that Hatton carries weight and Chris needs to work with him. Chris is leaving the office when he encounters Detective Michelle, an old love interest. The two decide to catch up after work and meet up at a bowling alley. The two catch up on old times and she brings up his family, but Chris prefers not to talk about it. After the date, Chris walks Michelle home, where she urges him to talk things over with his brother and kisses him on the cheek goodnight. Next, we see some gangsters pull up to their hideout, unaware that a team of cops including Ken and Hatton are closing in around them. The cops break into the compound, but a gangster spots them and raises an alarm. He runs off, but Ken chases him down and puts him in handcuffs before hearing a gunfight erupt inside. He brings the handcuffed man back into the building when he passes a few cops who are carrying bags. He encounters another cop named Perry, who tells him that Hatton is waiting for him out front, then tells Ken to hand over the gangster in a threatening manner. Ken complies, and the gangster begs him not to leave him alone with Perry. As Ken rounds the corner, he hears a single gunshot and a body hitting the floor. Chris is at home that night when there is a loud banging at the front door. He goes to check and is shocked to see Ken, who collapses to the ground, covered in blood. Chris desperately tries to help him, but Ken weakly hands him a hard drive before passing out in his arms. A neighbor who had seen Ken calls the cops, and two of Hatton's men, Spencer and Gale, come over. Gale goes straight for the neighbor wanting to talk, while Spencer is concerned if Ken said or gave anything to Chris. Chris instinctively tries to hide the drive, but Spencer sees this and holds a gun to him. Gale returns, and he and Spencer force Chris to retreat back into his apartment and close the door. Spencer begins to demand Chris tell him what he learnt from Ken. Chris refuses to speak. Gale then puts a gun near to Chris and yells out "gun," but Chris manages to avoid getting shot and quickly knocks out the two cops. He then rushes from the apartment barefoot, and Gale, who barely recovers, comes looking for him, but Chris is gone. Michelle is asleep when she gets the call about the attack at Chris's apartment and heads over. She sees Ken dead at the door and stares in shock. She heads into the apartment where she meets with the lead forensics guy, who brings her to Ken's car out back. She learns that Spencer and Gail were on the scene before anyone showed up. They had explained that they heard shots while passing and they were attacked by, as they described, a random Asian male who is now missing, and Michelle wonders what could be happening. We then see Spencer and Kurt nursing their wounds. Hatton soon pulls up to the scene and the two cops get nervous. Hatton asks them if they found the device and gets mad when he learns they failed. Gail tries to make excuses, but Hatton headbutts him, dropping him. He is not done, as he pulls a gun and puts it to Gail's head, and he orders them both to find Chris and kill him or someone will pay. And the cops agree. We then see Chris walking barefoot through the city when a cop in a patrol car spots him and the cop makes a call. At the station, Michelle aggressively approaches Archer, demanding to know what is going on as Ken is dead, Chris is missing, and eyewitnesses say 2 off-duty cops may have been involved. Archer has given her the case to investigate as she trusts Michelle. Archer wants answers but cannot have anyone handle the case as Chris is being accused and his reputation is at stake. Michelle then gets a text and rushes from the office. The cop who saw Chris then meets with Gail and another killer named King, telling them that Chris is inside the bowling alley. Meanwhile, Chris is sitting alone when he hears the news of him being accused of killing Ken. Outside, Gail and King are prepared to go inside when they see Michelle pull up and rush inside. She sees Chris and approaches him, startling him. She apologizes for Ken and wants to help him out, and is shocked to hear about the 2 cops that Ken was running from. He shows her the drive, but she wants him to turn himself in and put him in protective custody. But Chris does not think she can protect him from the cops. She has to do her job, so Chris tells her to forget it and leaves. Michelle comes to find him in the restrooms, not sure how he wants her to help him. Chris hands her the drive, and she hesitantly accepts and leaves, promising to talk to Archer. Once Michelle drives off, Gail and King ready themselves to go after him. The 2 rush in and catch Chris off guard, holding him at gunpoint. Gail demands the drive and Chris tells them he has it on him. King comes to search him but gets too close, and Chris manages to disarm him. He attacks the men with swift moves until they push him back, then attack him at once. Chris fights them both off as best as he can, until he knocks King back, then uses Gail's face to stop a bowling ball. Chris asks about Ken's killer, but Gail refuses to talk, so Chris throws Gail onto the bowling lane and starts rolling balls at him, until Gail gives in. He mumbles that Ken saw something but passes out before he can finish. Michelle is going over the case when she stumbles on a news article about Hatton accusing him of stealing evidence. Chris leaves the bowling alley and takes Gail's car. Michelle goes to visit her best friend Abby, wanting her to access a damaged drive, noting that she cannot bring this to the police. Abby agrees to help, and Michelle leaves the drive with her. She heads back over to the bowling alley only to see blood all over. She finds the store manager unconscious on the floor and calls it in. Chris heads over to a store where he gets himself some tools and items preparing to go to war. Michelle calls in her suspicions to Archer about Chris seeking revenge against Hatton, but Archer is not surprised. We then see Hatton pulling a beaten Gail out of a truck, scolding him for not following his orders as Hatton had told him not to move. Hatton demands to know what he told Chris, but Gail swears he said nothing. Hatton then orders the men to lay low as he plans to take care of Michelle. Michelle meets with Archer at a restaurant, suspicious about her calm demeanor when Hatton reveals himself. He gives Michelle a file of his officers' medicals, which would clear them of any wrongdoing. She sees no reports of Chris, but Hatton tells her that Chris is the one who shot Ken, and his officers were just responding to shots fired. Michelle is not accepting this, and accuses Hatton of committing the crime. Archer calms them down and reminds them that the goal is finding and bringing in Chris alive. Michelle tells Archer what she saw when she entered the bowling alley, and that the security footage was taken. Michelle and Archer ask Hatton about the whereabouts of his team, but he tells them they are off duty. That night, Spencer is at home when he hears a sound and comes checking with his gun. He thinks it's just the sprinkler. But Chris ambushes and knocks him down, disarming him. Chris then holds him at gunpoint and forces him to tape his mouth shut. Chris then begins to wield his custom weapon, telling Spencer to pick up his gun, but every time he tries to do so, Chris beats him down brutally, with the tape muffling his screams. Chris removes his tape and Spencer apologizes for Ken, but swears it was Hatton and Perry who did the act, and he did not see. Chris does not believe him and demands the code to his cell phone and leaves him there, warning him to keep his mouth shut. Hatton leaves the meeting and gets a phone call from Chris, telling him about Spencer and wanting to know if he or Perry pulled the trigger. Hatton threatens Chris, telling him that Ken was a threat. And now he is too, and Hatton will find him. Later, Perry pulls up to a location waiting on someone when he spots two black teens hanging out nearby doing nothing. He approaches them and begins to harass them, wanting to know what's in their bags. The scared boys comply, and Perry empties their bag on the ground. One of the boys scowls at Perry, who pulls his gun on the teen to intimidate him. Perry then hears a phone ringing nearby and the boys run off. There is a phone in the trash can, and as he answers the call, Chris attacks him. Using nails, Chris begins impaling Perry, demanding to know if he pulled the trigger. Perry refuses to answer, then dives for his gun, hitting Chris in the leg as he escapes. Perry chases after him into a building, letting off shots but running out of bullets. Perry pulls a knife, taunting Chris as he searches for him. Perry insults Ken, so Chris ambushes him, and the two begin to fight. They brutally throw each other around until Chris gets the upper hand and knocks him down. Chris then picks up a large metal canister, using it to smash Perry's hand. Michelle then picks up Chris, where she gets angry at him for attacking the cops as she is trying to keep him out of jail. But Chris reminds her that they tried to kill him. Chris does not care about jail, as he seeks vengeance for his brother. Michelle brings Chris to Abby's home to lay low. While Chris goes to clean up, Abby begins to freak out about what she saw on the drive. Chris comes back down and the two sit to watch the video when Abby is suddenly shot in the head. A masked man wielding a machine gun blasts his way in but gets shot by Michelle and escapes. Chris checks on Michelle, who is shot in the leg, when they hear the sirens in the distance. Michelle tells Chris to escape and bring the laptop to Archer. Chris escapes with the laptop. He sits by the side of the road and listens to a recording of Hatton talking with someone who sounds like Archer. The two complain about Ken snooping around and she plans to have him transferred to another unit. We then hear Hatton spot someone and open fire. Chris then reaches out to Archer, telling her that he found the evidence but it is encrypted. She gives him an address to meet up so they can take care of things. After the call, Archer then turns to none other than Hatton, telling him that Chris is on his way, and she thinks he knows everything. We then see Chris at his gym where he sprays a prop gun black, before lighting incense for his father and brother. At the address, Archer, Hatton, and his team are preparing heavy firepower and a ton-load of men to get Chris, and we also see Michelle being held captive. Outside, a van pulls up to the gate, and we see the same scene from the beginning, but Chris is wearing body armor. After wiping out the men, he comes searching for Michelle, when he encounters Archer holding her at gunpoint. She tells him to surrender, when Michelle shows Chris that she has a knife in her hand. Hatton then comes up behind Chris and knocks him down. Archer tells him to finish off Chris and leaves with Michelle. Hatton pulls his gun to attack, but Chris swiftly attacks him and the two fight for the gun. Hatton gets the upper hand on a weakened Chris and throws him hard. Hatton feels strong and tells Chris to get up. But this time, Chris uses all his skills to rush Hatton with strikes and throw him. Hatton then pulls a knife and slashes at Chris, who takes off. Meanwhile, Michelle manages to free herself and disarm Archer. Hatton goes looking for Chris, who wraps a chain around his hand and reveals his location to Hatton. The two face off, striking and evading each other. Chris eventually gets the upper hand, feeding Hatton some brutal punches before punching him over the railing. Hatton is not dead, and as Chris picks up a knife to end him, Michelle tells them both to stand down. Hatton tells them that there will always be guys like him, and they won't stop what is happening. Hatton tries to lift his gun, but Michelle is forced to shoot him dead. As they leave, Michelle tells Chris that Ken would be proud of him. The cops pull up, and Chris this time surrenders to them, getting vengeance for Ken. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you can watch more movies like this. Thanks for watching.